Welcome to the third episode of the True Progress podcast, presented by Perfectus Magazine. If you're unfamiliar with Perfectus, we're an online magazine dedicated to featuring thoughtful writing, engaging interviews, and unique artwork focused on the intersection of academic literature, public policy, civilizational progress, and human flourishing. In this three-part series, we delve into one of the most literally dividing issues facing Americans and the world today: polarization. Undoubtedly, it's something you've heard of and possibly even felt. It's all around you and affects your relationships, your interactions, your daily life, from home to work and back. But what is polarization exactly? And is it really as bad and pervasive as you may think it is? And most importantly, what can we do about it? In episode 1, we set the scene and define what polarization is. Then in episode 2, we explore its effects on society. And finally, in episode 3, we look for solutions and paths forward. Let's dive in. Episode 3, Finding Solutions. In the previous episode, we took a trip into society itself and examined how polarization is popping up and taking an outsized bite out of social cohesion, especially in politics, academia, and media. And admittedly, where we are in our relationships with our fellow humans feels very tenuous, fragile, belligerent. And that's no way for a society, a country, to function. Dan Vallone is the U.S. Director for the nonprofit research organization More in Common.
One of the benefits of More in Common working in multiple countries is that we do have a chance to look comparatively across Europe and the U.S. So there's a lot of similarities, and it's all democratic cultures, et cetera. But it helps because we have seen polarization worsen or become a more salient consideration in all of the countries we work in: Poland, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, UK, France, Germany, the US. Even though, for example, that these countries have different political structures in some ways, right? Many of them are parliamentary versus the US presidential. So oftentimes in the US context, we look to the fact that we have first past the post elections, that we have the two-party system versus a multi-party system as being disproportionately being an outsized influence on driving polarization. And I think our findings would ask us to be cautious about that, because in multi-party systems, we are seeing polarization. Like France, you've seen polarization worsen. You've seen social fracturing worsen. And so it is beyond just the ways in which we have organized our electoral and political systems. And I think at the biggest level, like, we are just in a volatile period. The nature of work has changed profoundly in the past 30 years in ways that have disrupted societies and changed the availability of certain jobs to people based upon their education levels. It has become very acute. People have been able to work remotely, and we saw during the pandemic, and that has been distributed in ways based upon education again in different things have become available based upon education in different ways. Media has also changed in significant ways. This is probably where the U.S. story is most notable, in that we have the most fractured left-right media. So there's lots of things happening. We've had a great financial recession of 2008. But this is a lot of change happening. So we would expect that in this kind of volatility, with these kinds of changes happening, people would be more vulnerable to identity-based polarization.
If you've been with us for the entire series, hopefully you'll remember our fictitious friend, Jim. Jim's life is definitely affected by this volatility in all aspects, from home life to work life, and even the commute in between. And Jim isn't dumb. He sees this division for what it is and desperately wants to find a way forward. He wants to be friends with his neighbors again. He wants to get back to joshing around with his workmates because the job is stressful enough as is. He wants the trip to the grocery store to be friendly and Mayberry-like. So he's listening and looking, but guardedly so, probably like most of us. But can we start unraveling this mess? Dan Vallone continues.
There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear about what's going to happen next. And those are two things that drive people to retrench into the identities from which they derive the greatest sense of security and belonging. And that creates these vulnerabilities. If folks offer belonging and security, but through a group identity that is predicated upon opposition or hatred of another group, right? So that's the vulnerability we create. And I'm not sure that in response to any of those crises, we've necessarily found ways to engage a robust sense of solidarity that lasted. And so I think we've pursued lots of different policy options. Obviously, this has been under Democratic and Republican administrations. And I think that we have consistently not been able to find ways to harness Americans' collective capacity to work together to address those seismic events. And so we've seen just an erosion and fracturing of our social ties, of the ways in which we find belonging, and in people's confidence that other Americans can be trusted. There's a particularly American tilt to that story, even if some of the trends are more generalized across lots of countries today.
That doesn't sound like good news for Jim or for any of us. But does that mean we're helpless and adrift without a paddle? Ben Klutsey is the director of the program on pluralism and civil exchange at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
I do think there are some good things that we can do right now and in the immediate term to combat polarization. If you truly care about fostering a more open society, in a society where people are free to express their views, you want to foster viewpoint diversity, I think that's important. I think academia is a place where, we can see a lot of leadership on that. Because it's an important place in terms of formation of young minds. And I think that it's really incumbent upon those institutions to begin to take the mantle on fostering viewpoint diversity. And so I think one of the ways that can be addressed is for people who themselves have held certain views for a very long time, begin to ask the question, why might that be the case? Why might someone disagree with this view, and go from there?
Indeed, the world of academia, once cloistered but now seemingly in the news every single day, is a great place to start, given the sphere of influence of higher education. For most of us, though, that's not our world. So can we go bigger, wider, broader, more encompassing of society at large? Clay Routledge is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute, and recalls group identity that we discussed in previous episodes.
So the same way that humans naturally organize ourselves in terms of groups, which can lead to bad outcomes, conflict, prejudice, discrimination, the same ability can actually help be part of the solution, because just as we divide ourselves along group lines, we can combine our different groups together to make what psychologists often refer to as a superordinate group. And so a superordinate group essentially brings together smaller groups. So an example might be in the United States, we have political groups like Republicans and Democrats, but both groups are part of a larger superordinate group of Americans. And so when we have crises or experiences in our society that pull us together across party lines, we see ourselves as part of this larger group. And just like we have a bias towards our own smaller groups, like, Republicans are biased for their fellow Republicans and Democrats are biased for their fellow Democrats. If you bring Americans together and they see that group definition as being an American, they'll be biased towards their fellow Americans against other, rival groups, could be in an international context. The Olympics are a great example of a superordinate group identity in practice when we think about sports. People have loyalty to their favorite sports team, and sometimes that causes them to have, negative feelings towards rival sports teams or athletes on rival sports teams. But every 4 years, what we do is we bring members of different sports teams together and put them on an American Olympic team, at least in certain sports, to compete with teams from other countries. That's a good example of of a superordinate group. It's bringing members of a bunch of other rival teams together that in the normal season are in competition with each other, and saying now you're all part of this one big team representing all of Americans, not just your regular sports team. And so that's a good way to think about superordinate groups in a sporting context.
For most Americans, they've likely experienced this when the Olympics come on every few years. And many, if not most, instinctively get this feeling of camaraderie and fellowship with their fellow citizens. But beyond a brief celebration over javelin throws, floor routines, and other amazing physical feats, what's the point? How do we rein in this effort to come together to actually benefit society? Clay continues.
In a lot of ways, I think the United States is a good example of a superordinate group in real life, in practice. Immigrants from around the world, people who are here from different cultures, from different backgrounds, have different experiences in their life, different goals, different priorities, different beliefs. And that's part of what makes our society so interesting and dynamic and entrepreneurial and innovative and really so dominant in many fields around the world. So we can use this concept of subordinate group identity in all areas of our life, not just sports or politics. So in our professional lives, you can think about it in your personal life, anywhere in which you can think of a group distinction that divides you, you can try to think of a way to unite across groups. One of the probably underappreciated but important benefits from that would just be like reducing the amount of emotional and cognitive bandwidth that goes to being angry, being outraged, being upset at other people. And if you free up your time to, if you're not scrolling social media and thinking about all the ways how Republicans or Democrats are trying to destroy America, then you've got more time to do positive things. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of self-work we could probably all be doing instead of spending time thinking about the ways that our political enemies are harming society. We could spend more time thinking about ways where we could improve our own lives and make contributions to our families and communities. There's always going to be things that are extremely divisive that are just going to be really, really hard to get any movement on. And that's not always bad. It's not always bad to be at a kind of standoff on certain issues because they are complicated and there isn't a clear answer. But if we could kind of push some of those aside and focus more on the issues which we can find some consensus on, or at least find an openness to, to have competitive tests of, or to cooperate on, then we could at least make progress on some things. I mean, just to give a concrete example, we know that obesity rates have been increasing in the United States. And that's something that is a big problem for people's individual health, but also for our society. I mean, there already is extreme economic costs, lost productivity as a result of so many Americans being unhealthy. But that's something that we could, probably work on in our personal lives and also work on, and come together at some level to make practical progress on that.
Losing a few pounds and not going through rage cycles on a daily basis sounds pretty good. In our happier states of mind, it does become much easier to imagine coexisting with our neighbors and fellow Americans. However, as healthy as it is to spend time on positivity, there are undeniable obstacles that we still have to contend and grapple with to untangle this cantankerous, roily social discohesion. Tony Woodlief is the Senior Executive Vice President with State Policy Network and author of I, Citizen, a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance.
What worries me the most about the future of the United States is we have a fundamentally corrupted, broken, and tone-deaf political party system. And we have allowed the people in charge of these parties, both parties, to amass an incredible amount of power in Washington, D.C. in the hands of unelected people, judges and agency officials. And they are dismantling our civic institutions. They are wrecking our economy. They're putting us on the verge of war, it seems like. And so what I worry about is that we won't find a way to correct what they've done, what they're doing. People begin to believe that half the country hates the other half, and they begin to retreat from one another and from their institutions. And that just empowers these political elites who like it that way because they hate democracy. They don't want us to decide anything for ourselves. They need conflict between us. And that could steer us towards civil war. And so then I get all Tocquevillian and I suggest, look, the ways that we can be bound together as fellow citizens are to come together around things other than politics, and then that could be, your church, your community group, whatever it may be, your workplace. And there's been a lot of sort of technological changes, social changes, as Robert Putnam has written about, that have eroded some of those bonds between people. But the flip side, with technology and relative wealthy society, there's a lot of opportunity to re-knit those bonds, to forge new bonds. And so that's what I encourage people to do, because begin with yourself. What about me do I need to work on? Because that's a lifelong reform project. And then if I got that under control, how do I love my neighbor? Right? What does that look like to love my neighbor? Not in sentiment, but in action.
There's an important realization here, that this sort of social discord isn't new. Historical texts are rife with it. Sure, it's different today in degree and in temperament, and in some other consequential aspects as well. But division has long been a tool of destruction, from within and from without. But as important as it is to recognize the historical divisive conflict between citizens, it's just as crucial to realize that the institutions that can calm us down and dissolve that conflict have also been with us forever. Like Tony mentioned, church, community group, and workplace, but really any social group not centered around division. A book club, volunteering at the Boys or Girls Club, group outings centered on hiking or photography, or discovering new restaurants. Anything that has, as its goal, bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. And yes, it's not irony to point out that those very same tools of social media that cause us to see red are perfect for organizing those book clubs and outings and volunteering. Tony continues.
Despite all of the troubles we faced as a country in the past 30 years, economically, politically, despite, disastrous wars and squandering our reputation and the lives of young people around the world, despite declining trust among everyday Americans in a variety of institutions that ought to be strengthening us as a country, you still have this basic goodness in the average American. It doesn't mean they're saints. And I'm not even saying that they're better than the average Frenchman or Canadian. I'm just saying that there's a fundamental willingness to help one's neighbor, to compromise, a deep desire to have community. I think there is a troubling reality. There was a way of kind of assessing progress of young people into adulthood that had a series of thresholds. We would consider this young person to be moving into adulthood if they've graduated from high school, gotten a full-time job, gotten married, had a child, and maybe there was something else, maybe go to college or something like that. So back in 1960 or whatever, around 2/3 of young people by the age of 25, they had crossed, several of those thresholds. And then you fast forward to today, and it's a much lower percentage of young people who are 25 and older who have crossed those thresholds, even any of them. It doesn't mean you have to do those things to be a fulfilled human, but it's a general decent measure of, are you moving forward in life towards maturity? And then we also have a reality that there's an alarming portion of young men who are completely disengaged. They do not have jobs. They're not incarcerated. They're not in hospitals. They're not in school. They don't have any significant romantic relationships. They tend to live at home. High percentage of them have some sort of opioid or alcohol addiction. And they play video games or watch YouTube on their phone all day. And it's a massive number of young men. I can't remember the number, but it's like an army of depressed, angry, utterly disconnected young men across the country. It really just comes back to, are we helping people acquire identities that are beneficial to themselves and our communities? There's a lot of little movements that people are trying to sort out. How do we teach young people to have conversations? How do we teach tolerance? How do we bring people into community? I've met a lot of people who have their own sorts of hybrids of that, which boils down to, if nothing else, I'm going to bring some people in my community together. We have something we call the Hall of Men here in the Greensboro, North Carolina area where I'm outside of, modeled on the very same thing in Wichita, Kansas, which is where I learned about it. And it's ecumenical gathering of dudes who get together once a month, and we talk about like some hero of the faith or some like important social issue. After that god-awful, shooting in Uvalde, we got together and talked about that. As fathers, many of us, what are we going to do when you've got these young men who are just becoming monsters? And then my wife started the Hall of Ladies, where they do the same thing. So it's stuff like that where I think every one of us has some authority to begin building those bridges. At the big level, my gut tells me that, like a lot of sicknesses, you heal it at the cell level, bit by bit.
Tony and Clay are certainly both echoing much of the same thing, that communities coming together can form the separation barrier between us and the forces driving us apart. It sounds a bit too good to be true. Our friend Jim can't even stand making eye contact with his neighbor. He, just like many of us, has lost real-life friends on Facebook over silly arguments that never would have escalated into something so big face-to-face. So is this all a big pipe dream? Is there truly a possibility of us mending fences? Tony Woodlief goes on.
Still a lot of wellsprings of trust in average Americans in one another. There's not the animosity that the mainstream media suggests exists among most Americans. And so that's pretty impressive, I think, given all that has happened and all the distractions that want to pull us into our basements and away from our communities. Despite lockdowns and everything else, you still have a pretty wide reservoir of trust and goodwill among Americans. And so that gives me hope that the right, reforms or all these sorts of community level efforts, there'll be a response to it. And so what I encourage is think about what you can do in your community. Don't swing to the fences and try to come up with the one law or reform or, God forbid, candidate who will fix all of it. But you fix your little part, and I'll fix my little part over here, and we'll all learn to love our neighbors a little more. But I think that's the only thing that works in the end, right? Is start reforming myself and then love my neighbor, and I'll be faithful in that. And if enough of us will do that, then, it inoculates us against the political class, and it gives us more bonds in our communities.
There is an inner turmoil at work here. What if I spend my time doing just that, fixing what I can fix but no one else does? That's a natural reaction to any sort of challenge. But leading by example is a tried and true strategy. What's the alternative? To keep digging the hole we already find ourselves in and hope we make it all the way to some magical conflict-free land? If we look at all of our experts featured in this series, they're doing just that, dedicating their lives and expertise to fighting the forces of polarization. Ilana Redstone is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and the faculty director of the Mill Institute at the University of Austin in Texas.
What we're doing at the Mill Institute is working largely in educational spaces to create the kind of environment where broader conversations on heated issues can happen between whether it's administrators, students, instructors, and we're thinking educational spaces. It could be sort of public facing as well. So one of the things that we've done is we've just wrapped up a teacher institute where we were working with 10 teachers, 9 in the US and 1 in Canada, where they were in groups and they were sort of developing resources, all oriented towards helping educators who are currently in the educational system advance sort of broader conversations, more viewpoint diversity in their schools, in their classrooms. And then the other thing is programming. Part of what, from the Mill Institute standpoint, we're seeing is that there are not a lot of models in terms of public discourse where people are tackling the most contentious issues in a way that isn't a debate. So the series is called Say More, and the idea is to take issues and really the goal is not to be persuasive. The goal is not to change people's minds. So we're bringing in sort of public intellectuals. I'll be moderating these conversations and trying to think through whatever heated topic it's on, whether it's, gender affirming care for kids who are interested in transitioning, I suppose, or whether it's race and college admissions, or whether it's immigration policy, whatever the issue is, and sort of thinking through the different ways of coming at that issue and making all of those things that are usually implicit, like as people are making their arguments, what are the assumptions that you're making about whether it's an empirical assumption about how you think X causes Y, or whether it's an assumption that you're making about what is the morally superior path to choose when you have the interests of 2 different groups or more than 2 different groups that are in conflict? How are you deciding which group's interests should dominate, should take precedence over the other? Why? Why is it that group over? Again, so not about convincing anyone, but about taking all of that thinking and talking it through out loud. With Say More, success is, does everybody leave a little bit less sure of their opinion than they were when they walked in? I don't care if you change your position on something, because if you're a little bit less sure, if we've opened up sort of a micro space of doubt, and I'll credit Carlo Rovelli with that term, with a micro space of doubt, you can't justify demonizing people if you're not so sure that they're actually demons.
Less demonization of our fellow Americans would be a fantastic thing, opening up opportunities for dialogue and the proper exchange of ideas. Ben Klutsey is the director of the program on pluralism and civil exchange at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
Mercatus has been around for about 41 years, and we are involved in the marketplace of ideas. So some background about the program on pluralism and civil exchange and why the Mercatus Center decided to establish this new program. Over time, we have realized that this marketplace is kind of shifting towards discord and conflict, and that we've become more and more polarized, as I described earlier. And so we started to think about ways in which we can help. And, for a long time, Mercatus' ethos has been, respect, intellectual honesty, humility, these types of principles that we think that can help inform society about, how we might move towards a more pluralistic society. We're providing fellowships to students who are going on to study. They're getting their PhDs, they're getting their master's degrees. And so we have professors who are mentoring these students and training them and helping them understand different ways of looking at the world. And then we have scholars who are thinking about the ideas and thinking about, society and thinking about how academia can inform questions that we're experiencing in society. We have psychologists, philosophers, political scientists, experts in religion, journalism, in different spheres who can help us think through what the problems are and what the solutions are. And we are thinking about them in 4 thematic areas. The first is looking at institutions. What is the role of institutions in creating the situation that we're in right now, and how might we rebuild or recreate new institutions that would help take us out of this current situation. We're thinking about social psychology, the issues related to loneliness and fear and anxiety that lead people to attach themselves to some very illiberal ideologies that prevent us from having pluralism. And so it's been an interesting thing to see that type of research emerge. We're looking at illiberal trends or trends in illiberalism. There are ideologies such as nativism, populist authoritarianism, socialism, not the Denmark or the Swedish type, but some types of socialism that are, I think, that antithetical to a more liberal society. And finally, looking at the practice of pluralism. How do we actually engage? How do we disagree better? How can we have civil discourse? And so there are people who are actually studying and thinking through these processes. So that's been really great to see.
That covers academic circles and institutions. But are there opportunities for people like you, me, and our buddy Jim to participate in? Ben explains.
We have to learn to engage with ideas that we disagree with. I think the only way we can learn about them and how we can even challenge them is to really figure out ways in which we might disagree with a particular thing. So one of the projects that I'm excited about is one called the Lyceum Movement. And it was founded by a young man who had worked in democratic and sort of conservative circles. And, before the pandemic, he moved back to his hometown in Iowa and was thinking about polarization and how we might do something about this. And he realized that, there used to be something called the Lyceum, and it existed in the early days of the formation of the country, but it started to die down towards the early part of the 20th century as we saw the rise of mass media. And so he is starting to build a movement around that. And the Lyceum is really a in-person gatherings across the country, and they have local chapters all over. And the goal is to bring in speakers who are also part of the community, who are answering interesting questions about what's going on in society. They try to localize the topics and the questions, and they don't try to nationalize the topics, because when we nationalize issues, they become very, very dichotomized into Democrats and Republicans. But it's asking very simple questions about what is the history of this town? How did we come together? And they're filling rooms in a lot of these areas with people who are just interested in talking to each other in person about whatever questions there are about these local areas. I think one of the challenges that we're experiencing in our society right now is just a lack of community. And as people have moved further and further away for various reasons, and as people are spending more time in the online spaces, it's been hard for people to form in-person bonds with people. And I think that people are missing that. And so things like the Lyceum is creating an opportunity. They have 6 chapters across Iowa right now, and the goal is to scale and build.
When was the last time you went to a gathering like this to have a group conversation in person? For many of us, it's completely novel. And yet, it has so much precedent. Is that lack of person-to-person connection part of the problem? Probably. Dan Vallone on his organization and what they're accomplishing.
So, More in Common, we work as part of a multinational effort. And so there are More in Common teams in the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and the US. And we are relatively new, and we were launched to try and really better understand what is driving this identity-based polarization and what should we do about it. And We approach this primarily through a research lens. So we do large-scale surveys, we do focus groups, we do interviews, we do all kinds of qualitative research so that we can really understand both how Americans or Brits or Germans experience polarization, how they feel about their societies. And then we can also look at like what the empirical data says. What are we actually seeing when presented with fairly rigorous studies that we can measure over time? We approach it through really rigorous research, and we look at things primarily through the lens of social psychology, because we believe that there are many changes happening, that we live in a volatile moment, and so people are responding oftentimes in a way that is best understood through the literature of social psychology, through conflict studies, trying to understand how do us versus them narratives take hold in societies and become the dominant drivers. And then what do you do to diffuse those situations? What are those ways in which you can reduce the extent to which polarization creates situations where we can't govern anymore, where we can't engage constructively with one another? And so we integrate into all of our research those kind of findings where we can surface the more complex pictures of societies than what we are typically seeing in how people are described in media and politics, right? So conventionally, we use demographics or people's party ID to describe them, as if Republicans or Democrats are monolithic groups, when we know that people are so much more complex and nuanced. And when we bring that nuance to the surface, we all of a sudden can see many more areas of commonality. We can see that common ground still actually exists, and that there is more that unites us still as Americans than divides us. So that is a large part of our research, is we're really trying to surface the complexity in our societies, identify the areas of common ground. And then the third thing that we do is we try and work with a variety of partners across the ideological spectrum, across the country, in figuring out how can we better communicate and engage across our lines of difference to elevate these areas of common ground, right? So we actually need to be able to put these research findings into practice alongside of groups who are trying to communicate or run community level initiatives that bring together conservatives or liberals or new Americans and longstanding residents, all in the service of trying to build that sense of a bigger us.
Objective data is valuable, and Dan and More in Common are gathering, studying, and compiling this information to help all of us get a richer understanding of this polarization problem. Clay Routledge speaks about his work.
I think every society is going to have their own cultural scripts or narratives or ideas that they can turn to, their cultural stories that they can turn to help connect them. Here in the United States, I think the American dream is a powerful one. We here at the Archbridge Institute have done a lot of work, obviously, in this space, looking at how Americans conceptualize the American dream, essentially what they think is essential to living the American dream. And what we find is that there's actually a lot of consensus. People from different walks of life, different background, different groups, and how they think about the American dream. You need like a common thread that can connect people within a society. And I think the American dream one is a good one, for our country. We also find that this is generally the case across the political aisle. Like people on the left and right generally agree on what's most important to the American dream. And just to resolve the mystery for anyone who's thinking about it, it's not getting rich. It's not driving the nicest car, having the biggest house. I mean, what Americans agree upon is that the American dream is about having the freedom to live the life they want and being able to really cultivate a good family life, to have, close relationships and family.
The American dream. It's almost a cliche, and yet it's deep and rich with meaning and significance. It's the overarching vision of this country, and although we may be off the rails, it's foundational to the idea of liberty. And to put a finer point on it, polarization is a path to the dissolution of that very liberty we profess to love. The notions of free markets, voluntary cooperation, and live and let live are all hinged on us getting along. Not in a rainbows and unicorns way, but certainly in a spirit of tolerance and having common goals. Clay Routledge.
We're a country that is divided on a lot of issues, but at least a willingness to see, well, we share this country and we need to make progress on certain things. You can imagine that more positive vision of the future versus one in which, no, we're just going to fight over every little thing. We're going to just distrust each other. We're going to try to undermine each other's efforts. We're going to, just create a climate of fear. You don't have to be a genius to guess which society is going to probably be more creative and prosperous and have greater well-being and overall flourishing. We can recognize that we are part of larger superordinate groups, and that can help us coordinate in the service of shared goals. And at the same time, recognize that people aren't just members of groups, they're individuals. And we can renew our commitment to individual liberty, individual rights, and remind ourselves that there's a lot of things in life that just have nothing to do with, or at least aren't best understood through the lens of groups.
Ben Klutsey.
I'm excited that it seems as though there is a movement towards civil discourse, a movement towards depolarizing our society. Some call it the bridging movement. And I'm excited. I think that there's a lot that we can do to move the ball forward.
Dan Vallone.
I think we are seeing indicators that among the exhaustive majority, there is an increasing appetite to reject intense us versus them narratives. All of these are kind of like fluid developments, but I think that there is a potential case that a lot of Americans are getting more fed up with the consequences of an hyper-polarized politics and are choosing more moderate candidates or choosing to at least reject more extreme options and trying to do things that are different than what we've been doing in the past several political cycles. But it's still all kind of in the mix. And there's not a clear trend line in my analysis about whether things are getting markedly better or markedly worse.
It might seem the wrong note to end on, that Dan's data doesn't show a clear direction for our society. But really, it's the right one. Because there is no savior to swoop in from the clouds and save us from ourselves. It truly is up to each and every one of us to take that initial step, to switch off the news, to close the social media app, to look inward, and to reach out. Indeed, let's pay one more visit to our friend Jim. On his next evening walk with the family dog, once again he sees his neighbor and former friend, Stanley, out in the front yard, doing his usual thing, futzing with the garden spigot, getting a little wet from a pinhole leak in the hose while watering his prized petunias. A happy memory suddenly flashes in Jim's mind, a time he and Stanley were joking around during one of their famous backyard barbecues. And rather than keep his face down in his phone as Muttley pulls him down the sidewalk, Jim looks up and catches Stanley's eye, throwing a smile and a little wave his way. A sigh of relief washes over both of them. Yeah, it's hokey, but maybe that's the sugary antidote to all this poisonous polarization. Thank you for joining us for this final episode of True Progress Polarization, presented by Perfectus Magazine. For more information, visit perfectusmag.com and sign up for our newsletter to make sure you never miss an article. And be sure to check out the great work being done by our interviewees and their excellent organizations. Links are provided in the show description.